Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My very special guest today is the just passed Chief Judge of the Municipal Court in Newark, New Jersey. Her TED Talk from December 2017 entitled How Judges Can Show Respect went viral with over 1 million views, and it was translated into 11 languages at last count. She's taught at Rutgers University Law School in Newark, such courses as problem-solving justice, and now she is a consultant on procedural justice, which we're going to learn all about today, not only around the country, but around the world. Just back from Scotland, my guest, Judge Victoria Pratt. Judge Pratt, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. Judges don't always get invited to the party, so I'm very happy to be here to share what I'm doing.
Well, that's right. And we love judges on this podcast because for exactly that reason, our listeners and most people don't really have many opportunities to actually talk to a real judge. And you are truly an exceptional judge, now a former judge, because of the philosophy on judging, but more than just a philosophy on judging, I think, that you brought to your courtroom and that you're now talking about as you go around to groups around the country and indeed around the world, this idea of procedural justice. So I wonder if we could just start by making sure we get an introduction to what that is, and then I want to ask you about some of your background and how you came to this approach.
And so procedural justice is this concept that says that if people feel that they are treated respectfully, if they feel that they're treated with dignity and respect and fairly by the court system, by the justice system, that not only does it increase the public's trust in the justice system, but it increases compliance with judges' court orders, and it also increases compliance with the law. And what we're in is the business of compliance with the law, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And so if offenders understand the process, so there's this principle of understanding, if they feel that if the process is neutral, so this idea of neutrality, if they feel that they're being treated respectfully, and very important, that they have an opportunity to tell their side of the story, that they have voice in the process. The data shows, Tom Tyler began to study back in the 70s why people obey the laws, which is also the title of one of his many books. Mm-hmm. And he found that when those things were present in the judge's approach, that the court actually was able to have this transformational impact on defendants. And not only on defendants, but the people who are sitting in the courtroom, so other court litigants, people who come with them. I like to say that respect is contagious, that you can actually touch the person who's sitting in the courtroom by being respectful just by engaging the person that's in front of you respectfully and using procedural justice. And it changes their approach and how they see the justice system and what their responsibility is without even having to directly communicate with them. And that procedural justice begins not just when the person arrives to the courtroom, but it begins with their first contact with the justice system, which is usually when they're engaged with police officers or law enforcement. Mm-hmm. And what happens when they come in to the courthouse, and we have all these things. We have security that you have to come through and all these rules that we have, whether people understand how to get to the courtroom or where they're supposed to pay, and how people who work in the actual court building engage them when they're asking for information. And what happens when they get to the courtroom and people begin to scold them for rules that they didn't even know that they were violating because they didn't even know the rules before they got there.
Right.
And so all of those things have been impacting how people see the justice system. And what's significant and what's important is that people actually see the court, the judge, as a legitimate authority to impose rules and regulations. Because if they don't, then they don't feel that they have to obey the rules or the laws. People don't obey the law because they're afraid. They obey because they see you as a legitimate authority to impose those rules on how they live in their communities.
Well, this idea that we're, I think, used to thinking about the ideal of fairness in our legal system in so many ways. The constitutional idea of due process, the idea that we have a right to counsel, and therefore even the most humble among us citizens can go up against the largest, most powerful corporation, or even the government itself in court, and have something that feels like an even playing field in the courtroom. But dignity and respect, that seems and sounds like something really different from what I'm used to hearing about when I think about what goes on in the courtroom.
And you've been in the
Certainly.
courtroom.
I have been in the courtroom a lot, and I've seen my share of judges and opposing counsel, and there is a respect, I think, and sometimes a dignity to the process. The magnificent building that is the courthouse. The kind of the awesomeness of the experience, but this idea of human to human relationships within the court process being defined by dignity and respect. I think that is something pretty extraordinary. Tell us about uh, what does that look like in a courtroom?
What's interesting is this idea of this mutuality of respect that procedural justice is really calling for, and that we as judges should expect it to be. We have an expectation that people will respect the courtroom, the courthouse, the court process, that they will, I was in Scotland, and the people bow before the judge, and I just, of course, coming from this country, that was just very, it was an interesting thing to see. Mm-hmm. But this idea that if you have to respect this process also owes you respect. And it's interesting, you mentioned due process, and this idea that we have this constitutional right to due process, but how do you exercise due process if you have the right to be notified of a hearing and a right to be heard, but you don't understand what you have the right to be heard on at that part of the process? So how do you truly exercise that right if you don't understand whether that understand is English is your second language, you have limited education, people are using legalese, and so they're speaking above your head, and they're speaking at you, and these things have serious consequences. Anytime someone shows up in court, they're in crisis. And whether it's something as minor as, I might have a parking ticket, for a person who might now have a fine to pay as a result of this parking ticket, that's a crisis for them. And so the court need to be able to understand that we need to engage them in a way so that there's some level of comfort. We've compelled them to show up in this space that they would probably otherwise not want to come to. And even if they've elected to come there because they've brought litigation as well, there has to be some understanding that they have a right to be treated respectfully, with dignity, that they have a right to understand the process, that the process should appear neutral to them as well, and that they have a right to have voice. I mean, the research on procedural justice has also shown that people will be satisfied with the decisions that the court makes, even when they rule against them, if they feel that they were treated with dignity and respect and fairly by the process. So imagine the person is saying, wow, the judge got it wrong, but at least they treated me fairly. I got an opportunity to. And so it tells us that while people want to win, people are very concerned with this process. And the reality is that people spend more time in the process than they do with the outcome. You will probably have 3 or 4 court dates before you actually get to the outcome of your case. And it's what happens then. There's this book by Malcolm E. Lee that's called The Process is the Punishment. And so this idea that the court oftentimes just having to be subjected to the process of the court is punishment. And you haven't even been found guilty of what you've been accused of. So this idea, it should be embedded in everything we do, this idea that people are treated respectfully throughout the process.
Well, so you were the chief judge of the municipal court in Newark. So Newark is a big city in northern New Jersey. Municipal court is the court for smaller offenses and smaller claims, right? So these aren't big litigations that you would see in your courtroom. But you're probably seeing a lot of people in the course of a session while you're on the bench, right? And I mean, everything from what? I mean, can you give us a sense of the kinds of matters that come before you when you're on the bench?
I'll tell you this, that Newark Municipal Court is the largest municipality in the state of New Jersey. At its height, it was processing about 500,000 cases annually. There are about 24 or 26 law enforcement agencies that write summonses and complaints on this court as well. A large portion of the criminal offenses that go up to our superior court come out of our city, so a number of them get bounced back. So we end up seeing cases that are downgraded that typically wouldn't be downgraded in other counties. And so, again, it's a low-level offending court first appearances. So you're seeing, low-level drug offenses. You're seeing drug addiction. You're seeing prostitution charges. You're seeing truancy cases. You're seeing criminal mischief cases. You're seeing thefts and shoplifting cases as well. Things that run for low-level offenders. But your defendants are also, they're the drug-addicted prostitute. They're the Vietnam veteran who's been living at Newark Penn Station, who has been addicted to heroin since he was in Vietnam. You're seeing cases that result housing cases as well. And so you're seeing a gamut of cases that end up coming through the court system, and tons of people just kind of who initially were just being this conveyor belt of justice. I like to say that we had the charade of imposing fines, taking guilty pleas on cases with individuals that we knew couldn't pay. They'd come back. And this is not only happening in Newark, or it's happening all over the country. But, a person gets a fine, the judge gives them an opportunity to pay 2 or 3 weeks out. When they don't pay, a bench warrant issues for their arrest. We call these folks the low-hanging fruit. The police then stop them, arrest them, and bring them through the court system. And then we revise this time payment again. And ultimately, this person ends up getting that jail fine converted to jail time. And New Jersey recently changed its law so that even the mandatory portion of the fine could now be vacated as a result of jail time. So people would get so much of their jail time from all of the times it'd be picked up, and they'd have to sit in custody. And that's not justice, that's not justice, and that's not how you increase the public's trust in our system either. And so
for these kinds of claims that are coming before you, how does it look or feel different in your courtroom than most of the courtrooms we're probably used to?
So now,
or that we see on television.
Yes, we had, unfortunately, the city of Newark decided that Newark was to serve better, and they partnered with the Center for Court Innovation and the New Jersey Judiciary, and they created Newark Community Solutions. And Newark Community Solutions is the nonprofit that is in our courthouse, and we now have a community court. And so what that does is that it provides alternative sentences for defendants who would otherwise get jail. And those alternative sentences include individual counseling sessions, group counseling sessions, as well as community give back, which is what we call community service. And it also can involve getting connected with a GED program, getting connected to mental health services, as we have a mental health initiative, getting connected with the VA, where we actually have the VA come down to the courthouse with their computers and getting people connected to their benefits and services and housing. And so it's this idea that if all of these cases, we've been criminalizing social ills and sending them to judges and telling the judges to do something about it, but not giving judges tools or resources so that, in fact, they can change these behaviors. Because it's really about addressing the underlying cause for people offending. If I get an individual who has a bunch of quality of life offenses that all are involving sleeping in public, drinking in public, and smoking in public, well, the issue is that the public is this person's home. And so even if you give this person a fine that we know they're not going to pay, a $50 fine, if you address the issue of homelessness, if you address the fact that this person does not have stable housing, that gives you a greater chance of keeping this person from coming through the system. And so
And
at the courthouse,
as a judge, how do you do that though? How?
so these cases, we have a court resource coordinator, and they look at all the cases before they come through the courtroom. So our community court is submerged in our arraignment court. And so in that space, this person looks at the person to see if they qualify for the program, and then they may make a recommendation to the prosecutor, like before you make an offer, this is the person that you may be able to recommend to this program. So as a part of the prosecutor's deal, it will be, you'll be a part of this community court program where you can now receive the services that you need, as opposed to just funneling and being herded through the courtroom and this whole cycle of the city jail and the courtroom, the city jail and the courtroom, or the precinct, the courtroom, and then the county jail as well.
So it sounds like part of the approach you're describing is to look at the person who is appearing before you as a person, and not just as an alleged offender of some crime. I mean, that sounds pretty big, but that's what I'm hearing you describing.
Well, that's what it is. And sometimes people say things like, "Well, they've violated the law." And when you're in an arraignment court, you've been accused of violating the law. The state still has to make its case.
Yeah.
And so in so many instances, we are forcing the court to make judgments about people without any information before them other than a complaint. And even if the person is convicted of this particular crime, what do we need to do so that judges can make meaningful decisions about the people who come before them? And it's absolutely right. There is a person that stands before you, and this is a person that is connected to this community that we as public servants, I'm talking about judges, serve. And so how does making a better decision from the bench for this person impact this family, particularly in communities where you see entire lines of families? You'll see, a large family and maybe 4 or 5. I was always so shocked when I was like, well, I know your brother, and how many of you are there? There's 5 of us, and 4 of them are in the system. Or I'd have a young man who had arraigned on a drug charge, on selling drugs on a minor amount, and he'll sit, and I'm like, but your case is done. Why are you still here? But he's waiting for the individuals who are in custody because his father is in custody. When I get his father's record may show that, oh, wow, here's someone who sold drugs in the 80s, went to prison, and when they came out of prison, they became a drug addict. So there's this cycle that you're seeing impacting these families, impacting these communities, that at some point we have to address. And having an opportunity to deal with putting both the father and the son in this community court, where now they have social workers, because they're in this clinic where you have social workers and you have case managers and you have community service compliance officers and you have community organizations, nonprofits. That's one of my favorite things about these community courts, is that now the court is engaging community organizations to provide assistance to these people who are coming through the court system, so that when they're finished with their court mandates, which are usually just a couple of days of mandates of coming back and forth to court, they now are connected to services in their own community. So for people who have mental health issues, who tend to live in public places, who will live at Newark Penn Station and get picked up and sent down to the courthouse when they're decompensating because they need their medication, but the officer can't afford to sit on the person when they take them to the hospital, so instead they end up at the city jail, that person now gets connected to one of our mental health providers in this community. They can walk there. They can spend the day in the day program there. They can get on their medication. Their families can now be engaged around providing services for them as well. And you get them stabilized. And so once they're stabilized, you have a better chance of preventing them from being engaged in offending activity, especially since so much of the activity that they get in trouble for is being disorderly, causing an alarm, screaming, shouting, and yelling. because they're not on their medication.
Yeah.
And so
Wow.
being able to use the court as a space, you're sending them to the court anyway. And that was what was like surprising to me. I was at the hospital, the emergency room, and I was like, wow, we have the same clients. It's all the same people who are coming through these spaces. And so even being able to now have the court engage with the emergency rooms and the services that are provided at our hospital so that we're speaking to one another, right? Because sometimes people end up at the hospital, they are in the middle of a psychotic break, they strike the police officer, that person gets arrested and sent down to the courthouse. They still
You
haven't
know,
gotten their medication.
it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting that you're drawing this analogy to what goes on in hospitals with doctors and healthcare providers, because there is a certain sense, I think, for a lot of us, that when we are face to face with the doctor, they're speaking a different language. They're not really
Oh,
looking at us as a person, uh, and more doctors, as part of their medical education, are actually studying psychology, bedside manner, things that make them more connected to their patients as human beings. And there are some similarities where the goal, after all, is to have a better outcome, whether it's patient compliance with their medications or their treatment,
absolutely.
or the kinds of things you're seeing, and compliance with the law, and not coming back to see you again on some different offense later.
I'm
It's
glad
it's
that you used that as an example. If I trust my doctor, I am more likely to take the medication that they give me. If
right.
I don't
That's
trust
right.
the doctor, I'm not even getting the prescription filled, not even getting it filled. And what is it that I need to do? What is it that I need from the doctor to trust them? I need to understand what you're talking about. I
Yeah,
need you to
that's
speak to
right.
me in plain English about why do I need to take this medication? How often do I need to take it? What is my condition? What is my condition before you even tell me that I need to take all this medication? I need to not feel like the doctor is in the bed with the pharmaceutical company. And I'm not accusing all doctors, but sometimes
Yeah.
you feel
No,
that way.
absolutely. Oh my God.
You know,
I actually do a fair amount of medical malpractice cases, and I can't tell you the number of times I've been sitting with a new client and I say, "What did the doctors tell you about what happened?" And they say, "I don't know. I don't know how my husband died. I don't know what went wrong in the surgery. Nobody has ever told me. No one's ever talked to me."
no one
It's
has ever told me. Or when I see a heroin addict that is clearly, I'm like, you had a really good job. You were living a life with your family. What happened? I had back surgery, Judge, and the doctor gave me painkillers and didn't wean me off of them. And heroin is easier to get.
yes, right.
Once I couldn't get any prescriptions for my back Medicaid, for my back pain. Now I'm looking at this person here who is now a defendant in my courtroom, right? And now I have to make decisions about what kind of punishment to give this person.
Mm,
But
right.
I'm looking at somebody and he's the victim. Here's a victim. And now you're asking me to punish the victim again because he trusted the person who gave him the medication, didn't he?
Well, it's
And
so
so now the
fascinating.
court,
Yeah, I
I'm
mean,
sorry?
Judge. No, I mean, I have to ask: is this is so different from what I think most people imagine goes on in our legal system. It's impersonal. It's punitive. It's very unconcerned with people as human beings. Do you mind giving a little bit of your personal background, and where you come from, and how you came to the law, and how you came to this, because it's something extraordinary, I think.
Well, I always say that we don't stray that far from the good stuff that we were taught when we were raised. It's always it's about what was developed in your moral compass. And I think that sometimes what happens is that things are taught to us and we throw them away, or we decide that if we get a particular title, we don't need that part of it. And so my father is an African American garbage man who spent his summers. He was born in New York, but he would spend his summers in the segregated South. And so much of that,
Hmm.
and even, having been born in the 40s in this country, shaped his perspective about who he was in this country. And especially being in the segregated South. And that was poured, and I saw it. I saw inequity early. I saw bias early. I saw racism very early in my childhood. My mother is Dominican, so English was her second language. And I saw what happens to people when they don't understand processes. And I saw how they were scammed and taken advantage of. And I think it just really upset me as a young person. Why would these things happen in my family? Because the terrible things that happen to adults happen to their children. And so my mom was also a beautician in the city of Newark. And so I spent a lot of time in the downtown area, which, by the way, I ended up like years later becoming the chief judge in the same space. And I spent all this time, and my mother was like a mother to the neighborhood. You know, she'd feed the homeless, drug addicts in the neighborhood would come by, and she'd give them money for food. And I always laughed that everyone had those protective shields in front of their stores and their windows. And my mother just had a glass window, and people would break into the shop underneath her, try to break into gated windows. And they wouldn't even throw a rock through her shop. They wouldn't even throw a rock to get into her shop. And I always thought, wow, that's powerful, right? Because there's something about her relationship with the people in this community. She could stand outside of her door and people would be engaged in a fight or an argument. And her very strong accent, she'd say, you know, you're not supposed to be doing that. And they'd stop and walk away. And then they'd apologize for upsetting her. And I thought, she's got more authority than the police in this community. And it was just because she treated them respectfully. I mean, my mother would go and visit them in the hospital, talk to them. And I thought, wow, this is love, right? Because what they're receiving is love from someone who's an elder in the community who's not judging their circumstances. Not judging their circumstances. And so most of the work that I did as an attorney was really to change the world and to really bring fairness to everything. And for those voices, you know, I filled out applications for family members who didn't understand, and for friends of family members who didn't understand, and also for people on my father's side. And what I found is that, wow, when you don't have an education, life is really rough. Life is really difficult when you don't understand. And so even as I began to practice law, I went to really tough places. I mean, you know, I ended up, and I don't know if this was my tough place, but I ended up working for Governor McGreevey. So I was in Trenton, but I was understanding these communities and how the executive branch really impacts people's lives. And that was powerful. I left there and then I went to the Canton City School District to serve as the compliance officer there. And I understood how broken education systems impact communities and impact generations of people, and how it just impacts your ability to make a life for yourself. So really kind of being on the ground in those spaces as well. So I kind of understood education from that. And what happens when all we do is teach children to take a test and not to learn? And then I understood something that was crazy to me, which was how much, how people benefit from our education system financially. And so how the dollar is really driving all of this stuff, and how it impossibly impacts urban children, particularly Black and brown children in these spaces, and poor children. And then I come to Newark and I start to work for the legislative branch. And I truly understand how minor laws, major laws, and how the decisions made at that level impact people's lives. And then I go to the judiciary. And I think that that's what probably gives me a very unique approach to justice, because I really do have a deeper understanding of how all of the branches of government ultimately impact people's lives.
Well, and I would go further, because, and as I'm listening to you, you know, you go through your story here, I'm thinking about how judges become judges. And because this is your journey to the courthouse, to the bench, into being a judge, and thinking about how the people I'm used to seeing as judges became judges. Most of them, frankly, were either came out of academia as a law professor, but probably more so from big law firms, big commercial law firms, produce a lot of our federal and state court judges, frankly. And I'm not disrespecting those people at all. That wouldn't be very good for me to do as a practicing lawyer here in Philadelphia, and I'm not, to all you judges out there. But you come from, your experiences that you're reflecting on are the community, education, government, lawmaking, and with always with a focus on how these different communities are affecting people's lives.
But I'll tell you this as well. I worked at the second largest law firm in the state of New Jersey as well. So I go where there's opportunity. Yeah, you can see, right?
There
really
goes my
cool.
theory.
But I didn't stay there long. I didn't.
Yeah.
But I've spent most of my time seeing how all of these spaces impact people's lives, but also having a deep understanding. One of my guesses is that I see people as they ought to be, but it's also a curse, right? Because I hold you to the standard of how you ought to be, because I truly see that. But that goes with being able to see the humanity in the folks who come before you or who are around you. And so when I got on the bench, I could not ignore people suffering, because that's what I saw. And that's what, don't get me wrong, judging is challenging. It is a really difficult job. There are these, there's this whole work around vicarious trauma that judges experience as a result of all of the trauma that they hear about and they see coming through their courtrooms, that they themselves begin to experience that kind of trauma. And then they themselves get sick, and feel trauma. And it's because there's, if you care about people, it's hard to leave this job at the job. It's difficult. We leave and you carry the people and something that someone may have said, and you want to make sure you did a good job, and you're going over this case and your judgment, and you're like, wow, did I do the right thing? Was I harsh on this person because of this or that? And so I think to be a really good judge, you have to constantly be questioning yourself. It's this whole idea of, like, with implicit bias, that it's the bad things that good people do because they're not aware that they do it, because it's just an automatic reflection. So for me, seeing the people come before me, I had to see more than just the allegation that was before me. I had to see more than just the circumstances. Like, I see you, and I know that there are circumstances that bring you here, but a part of my job is to make this community safe, and I make it safe by getting you to behave differently. But I also have an obligation to the victim. And sometimes people say, oh, what about the victim? What about the victim? And I don't feel that the way our current system works really restores the victim in this instance, because we're sending people back into communities that we haven't rehabilitated or helped get back on their feet so that they behave differently to live with these same victims. These victims are family members. These are relatives. These are your neighbors, right? And we need you back in these communities being productive. But the court is also contending with a whole bunch of seen things. I don't want to say they're unseen. We're dealing with poverty. We're dealing with communities that are fighting, joblessness. We're dealing with housing issues. We're dealing with gentrification and how it's going to impact people who've lived there. We're dealing with fear. We're dealing with violence. And so I contend that we have to do more. We're asking judges to deal with very complex cases and very complex problems. So we have to give judges better tools to help solve these problems. So for me, these problem-solving courts are exactly what these communities need, so that judges you can tailor justice in a way that people are getting exactly what you need. But that we also have to do some things that make us uncomfortable, which is engaging community. And that means engaging community members, community organizations, and the authority of the judge. I walk the city of Newark, and I walk it because I want people who see me to know that I participate in this community. This is my community as well. I'm not just telling you not to do these things or to create a drug spot on this corner because I go to the shop that's right behind it. This is where I eat lunch. This is where I buy this. This is where I come to speak at schools to talk to young people. So I don't want you out here. I don't want to see any of this. And I think that it makes the judge a more legitimate force in the community. I mean, if nobody's listening to anything you say, it makes you irrelevant. So,
I'm thinking about, I'm still thinking about what makes you different and what makes what you bring to the court, to the bench, to being a judge, to this idea of the law different. And even a judge who comes from the ivoriest of ivory towers, or spend a career, in some white shoe law firm, I don't know that we could say that person doesn't care, doesn't have compassion, doesn't have respect for the process and all that. But so that I don't think would be fair. But I think,
no, I definitely would say that.
I think I think what you've told us about your mother is really what you're channeling. It sounds like, and to quote the last line ever sung by the Beatles, my favorite Beatles song, the love you get is equal to the love you give, and you're doing something when it comes to respect and dignity that. Well, you have to give us some examples because it's so different. For instance, I know you've talked about this. Some of the alternatives that you've used in terms of sentencing, like essay writing, and tell us a little bit about that, because I think that is a great illustration of what it means in a particular person's case, or how you talk to the people who came before you when you were a judge.
Well, essays are great, and many judges do essay writing. I mean, I do them as a part of my sentence, and everyone wouldn't get an essay, but the essays are important because they give me an opportunity to give people voice, which also means that you have to learn to listen, and that you have to ask a question, not as a greeting, but as someone who's interested in hearing the response. And so when you ask a person to write an essay about a particular topic, and I would ask them to write essays about pretty deep topics, and many of them I had written myself. They were questions I had also answered. I remember giving this woman an essay about if I knew then what I know now, how would my life be different? And so much of that question to me is about just giving yourself information that you can use today. Because those things that if you had thought about then, how they would have changed your life, you can still do them. And so she opened her essay with, what did she say? She said, I've been suffering from a fatal disease for 24 years. And when I found out that I had this disease and got my diagnosis, I started doing drugs. I started hanging out with these folks. I started drinking. I started being very reckless. She just became very reckless because she thought her life was over. Mm-hmm. And when she was done talking, I had made a note. And I said to her, I said, do you know that you beat that disease 23 years ago? Because you can't have a fatal disease for 23 years.
Right.
Like every day you wake up, you tell that disease, I wish you would come and take me out. You fought that disease every year. And it's never occurred to you that you have been victorious, because in the story that you tell yourself about who you are in the story, you play the role of the victim. And it was her whole face changed. And it changed because she had never seen herself in that role of victorious, as a fighter. And I just thought, wow, by merely giving her voice, we were able to kind of correct that thought. Because that's what we do for most people. That's not true about you. When you are surrounded by a peer group, a group of people who care about you, they correct your thoughts and give you the highest view of who you are. And it was as if for the first time she was like, wow. And I looked at it and I'm like, wow, she probably doesn't even need this cane. But her entire existence is about this illness, that she fights every day and wins. Even if there are certain bouts that she goes down in, she still gets back up and survives another year. And I just thought the weight of carrying this fatal disease around, what it must be like, and why so now it explains to me why you make bad decisions.
Right.
It explains
Well,
to me because your life doesn't have any meaning. So now we just gave your life meaning. What happens now?
well, the other thing that I think is so fascinating about that story is you can imagine, and I know you've seen this up close and personal, but any of us can imagine that someone appearing in the criminal justice system or in the justice system generally might feel a sense of powerlessness,
Hmm.
and in some ways the system is designed much the way great cathedrals were built to make you feel small,
Hmm.
in the house of God. And we build these courthouses to be so magnificent, and the process can feel overwhelming and leave one feeling powerless in this great system that may hold our life in the balance. And what it seems to me you were saying to this person is you have the power. You were empowering her to feel that she could do something different with her life and for herself. And that's pretty powerful.
Because if that's not the narrative, then if the narrative isn't that you can change and you can make decisions about your life that kind of pull you out of this, I know that there's a whole bunch of other things that keep people stuck in the system. I know that. But if the narrative is not that, then the opposite is your entire existence will be within the four walls of a prison or a jail and coming through this. You have no ability to change anything that happens to you. And I'm not going to have people walking around believing that, which is why I fight so desperately to change the criminal justice system. Yes, we have to admit to the racism. Yes, we have to admit to classism. Yes, we have to admit that we're doing all of these things. Yes, we have to admit that the private money that's in the criminal justice system is hurting people into our prisons, that there are people who are benefiting from our prisons remaining full, that there are people who are benefiting from our children dropping out of high school. Yes, that there are people who are definitely benefiting for all these collateral consequences for very minor offenses, very minor offenses. I was listening to one of your podcasts, and one of the people said, they were talking about marijuana, and they said something
Mm-hmm.
about how the marijuana conviction is not what you see in prison, that there's just such a small portion of people who are going to prison for marijuana convictions that it was negligible. But the reality is that we don't have to physically incarcerate someone to put them in a prison. The conviction for a marijuana charge for one joint comes with, in New Jersey in particular, a ban on particular jobs, bans you from getting federal financial aid to go to school. And I know I needed it to go to school.
Wow.
Bans you from getting licenses, like to be a barber, to be a beautician, to be a phlebotomist. These convictions impact these things. And so what prisons have we created for people who are in our communities to walk around in? And then we hold them to the standard of being productive in our society. How? How, when you've cut off my knees? You've cut my legs off at my knees. How?
Right. We
And
don't
so
think
for
about
me,
that. We don't think about that kind of prison, the prison after prison, or the prison
prison and
instead of prison. Yeah.
surcharges, the surcharges that people have to pay, people plead guilty to traffic matters. And there are automatic surcharges that they're subject to. There are people who owe $8,000, $7,000, $9,000 worth of surcharges who have never gotten a driver's license because they've gotten it. They've gotten the surcharge before they've gotten the driver's license, or they've gotten the surcharge and then lost their driver's license and cannot pay the surcharge to become licensed drivers in our state or in our country. And then again, because you pled guilty to this traffic matter in a court, that penalty, which is not directed by the court, now impacts your ability to trust the court system, because now you've come to the court system and you've gotten this huge fine and this surcharge that prevents you from doing a slew of things. You can't drive a bus. You can't do a number of things because now you owe the state money that you didn't know that going through the red light was going to impact you doing that. So we have all of these things set up in our system that are just, I mean, they make my job really challenging. I'm up for the fight, but they just make it really challenging when you look at um, the criminalization of so many actions and so many acts, and how do people come out from under it? So we have to do something different in our criminal justice system, and we have to do something different in our courts, especially when there's studies are showing that the single most important factor in whether or not people in drug courts continue to use, whether they stay clean, whether they continue to reoffend, is the judge, and whether or not you believe that the judge treated you respectfully.
Hmm. So
And
what? So I know we're running towards the end of our time, Judge Pratt. But now that you're off the bench, I know you're devoting yourself to consulting and to lecturing and speaking about these kinds of things and the lessons you've learned through your experiences. What can you give us? Just a brief overview of what are the two or three things that you think could be changed to make a difference, with this, uh, with the procedural justice values that you've been talking about at the center. Are you talking to judges about this? Are you
everyone.
talking to lawmakers? Are you talking to school groups encouraging people to run for judge? I mean, what are your main focuses at this point?
I am speaking to everyone,
Yeah.
and everyone is really interested in this idea of how do we improve our justice system. And so I believe, like with procedural justice, this idea, if we spread this approach throughout our court system, that's the first easy and free thing that we can do. So I've been training judges, I've been training court personnel, I've been doing some training. There have been some police officers or law enforcement there. I've been talking to legislators, people who hold the purse strings for these specialized courts in their communities as well. I've been speaking to community groups as well. I've been speaking to students, law
Mhm.
students, and college students, really beginning to have them formulate these ideas in their minds so that when they begin, because they'll be writing policies around these things, and I want them to be writing policies that impact these communities, but that they have an understanding that you need to go and speak to Miss Betty. You need to go speak to these people. You need to be engaged when you write these policies so that you understand how they will impact the people who live there. So I've just been kind of doing that. I've been getting a lot of interest internationally, which was kind of fascinating to me that even in places that are as far away as Ukraine, people are like, we need to figure out what to do with our juvenile problem and how we've been housing our juveniles and what are better ways. And sometimes, I get challenged, who is the United States to be talking to us about our incarceration problem? But I feel like I'm that person swimming against the current and just trying to connect all of the innovations that are going on across the country to spaces and to people. Like if you're thinking about doing this, they're doing some really good work in Washington, D.C. with the juvenile justice system. Maybe we need to be thinking or talking. Maybe you need to go see this. So I've been able to kind of do that. The prosecutor's office in San Francisco is doing amazing things with expunging marijuana
Yes,
charges
I
from
saw that.
people's
Yeah.
records. Yeah, like an
Hmm.
algorithm. I'm like, that makes sense. And that feeds into access to justice. So I've been doing a lot of that as well, spreading, spreading the good news
Yeah.
and learning.
Fantastic.
And I just have been appointed to New Jersey's women's prison facility. So kind of looking at reform, and I've done some work with some people, with the guys over at Pelican Bay. So looking at the criminal justice system holistically.
Right.
So,
Wow. Well, and I'm so honored that of all these people that you're speaking with, you gave us your time to speak with me today and to speak with our listeners. Um,
thank you so
how
much for
can
doing
give
this.
us your website, Judge, because I know people will want to
Oh,
look you up and get more information on your background. I know
right.
you have a website.
So my website is www.judgevictoriapratt.com. I'm on Twitter and on as Judge V Pratt 1, and then I'm on Instagram as Judge Pratt 1.
Mhm.
I'm on Facebook, sharing these things as well. A book is coming. It's coming. It's
Oh,
coming.
good.
It's coming.
Good. Well, we'll look for that, and we'll put all those contact links in the description for the episode, so people can just click on it and get to you and your and follow you on Twitter and all of that, and keep up with what you're doing. It's
yes, and please watch my TED Talk. I
yes,
really think there's good information in there.
absolutely. I watched it again this afternoon. You can get that on YouTube. Google it. It's out there, easily found. And you're right, very well worth watching, and a great summary. And share this episode with your friends, everyone, because Judge Pratt's message is really a powerful one, and something that I hope many more people will be talking about in the months and years to come. Judge, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law.
Thank you so much for having me on. Thank you.
It was great. Thank you.